I was spending a couple weeks in Montana last year. I had a camper I was living out of set up on the back of my truck, so I was usually parking on campgrounds or wherever there was public land. This was one of my last days, so I had to start heading back from the direction I came. Unfortunately, I had a bit of trouble with my truck that day, and it took most of the day to fix, so by the time the sun was setting, I'd barely made any progress on my drive. I got a coffee from a gas station and decided to go at least for 2 more hours, then find somewhere to camp out the night. Over the next little bit that I was driving, the road cleared up and was pretty much all to myself. I used an app to find the nearest place I could camp at, and I found a spot that was just off the road on public land. When I got to the turn, it was a thin dirt path that went about a 1/4 mile into the woods. At the end was a small grass circle surrounded by the woods and nothing else. It was vacant of any other campers. I parked on the end of the circle, facing the exit, then walked around to the camper and got in. I think it was probably 11 or 12 by then, and I was just about ready to fall asleep as soon as I laid down. Only a minute or so later, though, a beam of light shined through the edges of the privacy screen that I had on my windows. I sat up and lifted the corner just enough so I could see out the window. Someone else's headlights were coming down the path. As they got closer and up to the end of the path, they slowed to a stop. It looked like they saw me and maybe didn't want to camp at the same spot, but instead of turning around, they just stayed there on the end of the path. I could see that it was a truck, pretty old looking, with rust all over their front bumper, but the headlights were too bright to see much of anything else. Since they were still on the path, too, their truck was facing directly at me and blocking the whole way out. Something about this felt off. It was just a gut feeling, I guess. But after a few minutes of them sitting there, I knew I wasn't going to be able to sleep here. I folded up my bed and got up. Before I could leave the camper and get into my truck, though, one of their doors opened. I looked back out the window. They had turned their headlights off, and 2 men were standing outside in the dark. They began walking toward my camper, and I could only see the outline of something in their hands. I covered the window again and listened to their footsteps approaching. They were trying to be quiet, carefully walking around my truck until they both suddenly stopped. It was like they suddenly knew somehow that I was awake. "Hey, can you help us? We're just in need of some directions. Can you open up?" I was terrified now, and from their voice, I think they were drunk or something, so I had no idea what they were capable of. I snuck a look out one of the windows and could see one of them right up against my truck, holding a type of crowbar, sledgehammer, or something similar. That confirmed their bad intentions, but I still had no way to leave without getting out of my camper and into my truck. One of them walked up to the door, scraping something against it and pressing into it, definitely trying to pop it open. I don't know why I was still trying to be quiet, as if they didn't know I was inside, but I put my legs against the door, trying to hold it in place. Then, completely out of nowhere, there was a gunshot. Not from the men, though. It was from farther out in the woods that were surrounding the area. Both men stopped for a moment, then sprinted back to their truck. Within 30 seconds, they were gone. I still had no idea what that was, but I knew if I was going to leave, now was my best chance. I fled from the camper and straight into the truck. I did a quick glance around as I started it up, but didn't see anyone in the woods that had fired their gun. I drove down the path and onto the main road, stopping an hour later at a relatively busy truck stop. What really happened back there is up for debate. Honestly, I think that by some miracle, a hunter or someone camping had been close by and saw what was happening, so they fired a warning shot to save me. Considering how remote I was though, it's just so unlikely that I can't say for sure, but it's really the only thing I can think of. If not for it though, my truck and camper would probably be anonymously listed on Craigslist right now, and I probably never would have been seen again. I was in Washington State, spending several days backpacking through the national parks. I was already about 20 miles out from the nearest road, and for the first 2 days, I hadn't run into a single person. It was the beginning of fall, so the weather was a bit colder than most people would be okay with, but I had all the necessary equipment. Anyway, in the morning, I got up and made a quick coffee over my pocket stove, then headed out to the next campsite. It was 6 miles out, which in the mountains is a pretty far hike. 4 hours into this walk though, I suddenly heard footsteps ahead of me. I looked up and saw a man walking along the trail, going the opposite way as me. I wasn't really expecting to see anyone, but I smiled and nodded as he passed by. But I noticed something really strange. He had no backpack, no water bottle, literally nothing. He was just wearing a long-sleeve t-shirt and some old hiking pants. I even turned around to get another look at him because I was so confused. When I did though, he happened to also glance back at me, so to keep things from being weird, I just turned back around and continued walking. After getting some distance, I kind of forgot about it. I think I came up with some idea that he had a campsite nearby and was just going for a walk, but I also knew that no established camps were anywhere near there. Whatever the case, I didn't find it worth thinking on too much. The next several hours were difficult, but eventually I made it to my campsite. It was empty, with just one small spot for my tent to go on. It wasn't as great as I was hoping though. The view was supposed to be a lot better, but from the actual campsite, there wasn't really any view at all. It was kind of covered up by all the trees. The whole campsite really just felt like it was in the middle of a forest, rather than on a mountain top. I was rightfully exhausted though, and went straight away to setting up my tent, and then relaxing while watching the sunset. As I sat there, I randomly heard a shuffling sound behind me. I turned and was completely stunned to see that same man I'd run into earlier. He still had no backpack or anything, but even more confusing was why he was at this campsite. He was walking in the complete opposite direction when I last saw him, and for him to get here now, he must have turned around pretty soon after running into me. As he walked up to the campsite, he didn't look at me, like he was purposefully pretending that I wasn't there, or that he couldn't see me. He went up to the other side of this small area we were in, and he sat down. No tent, no sleeping bag, no anything. Just sitting on the dirt and looking out into the forest. He was only 15 or so feet from me, but with him looking away, I was able to get a much better look at him. The man looked like he was in his late 30s and had a short scruffy beard with short brown hair. I couldn't help but feel really uneasy. Nothing about this was natural, and as the sun continued to set, it only made me feel even more unsafe. Who was this guy, and what the hell was he doing 25 miles out in the forest with no shelter or food or water? About 30 minutes passed, and he still didn't move. I decided though that I couldn't stay there. I had nowhere else to really go, but I figured I just had to find some random spot and make sure he didn't follow me. I began taking down my tent and packing up, and it was only then that the man looked over at me, and once he did, he never looked away. Every time I looked at him, he was staring right at me. Once I got everything stashed in my backpack, I saw in the corner of my eye that the man stood up. I began walking as fast as I could, hearing his footsteps following close behind me. I clutched my small knife tightly in my hands, unsure what was going to happen. After a minute, I looked back a few times, seeing him still following, but getting further away. Then I took a risk. I veered off the trail and into the woods. It was pitch black by now, so I hoped he didn't see me and would just keep walking. Once I was maybe 20 feet into the woods, I leaned out behind a tree and waited. 30 seconds later, his footsteps came down the trail, but just as he was about to pass by, he stopped. I watched his figure in the dark, looking around as if he knew I wasn't on the trail anymore. Then he started yelling. He was trying to sound friendly, too, which made it even more disturbing. After 2 minutes, though, he stopped yelling, but instead of going back to the campsite, he walked straight into the woods on the other side of the trail. His figure disappeared, and the woods fell silent. I must have waited there for over an hour before finally getting up and making my way back. I forced my body to push through and skip the next campsite just to be safe. When I was back in town, I put in a report with the local police office. They never followed up with me though. I don't know if that man was living out there, or was trying to rob or kidnap people, or maybe even both, but I'm lucky to have gotten away when I did. I work at a gas station. I'd been there for several years, and this night was one that I assumed would be like all the rest. I came in at 8 and took over for the day worker, who went home right away. The first couple hours went by quickly, as there were still customers coming in regularly to buy a few things or to pay for gas with cash. Between 11 and 12, it slowed down to where it began feeling like the shift was dragging on. I kept myself busy for another hour, or at least tried to, with stocking whatever I could find, but then I was left with the dreaded second half of my shift. It was always slow, boring, and just not enjoyable. Around 1 though, a car pulled in and parked in the spaces by the entrance door. A few other cars had come through recently, but just to get gas real quick. Very rarely would someone actually park in the spots and come into the store this late into the night. I stood up straight and tried to rub the tired look off my face, expecting them to come in. A couple minutes went by though, and they didn't. I leaned over the counter and looked out the glass door, but couldn't really see anything. The reflections on the door were blocking any way for me to see inside their car. Maybe they were just taking a break from a long drive. I didn't bother caring too much about it. I sat back and pulled up my phone. I spaced out, reading through random articles and whatnot for probably 20 or so minutes. During that time, I never heard anything or saw anything, but eventually I looked up from my phone and my heart almost stopped. There was a guy inside the store, standing in one of the aisles and looking right at me. His eyes darted away as soon as I saw him. This guy looked like he was mid-40, with a dark jacket on and a scruffy beard. I never saw or heard him enter, so how the hell did he get in? While my mind was racing, I just watched as the man kept walking around, glancing over at me a few times to see if I was looking, like he was planning to do something as soon as I looked away. Then, after just 30 seconds, he suddenly hurried toward the front door and ran outside. I got up and ran to look out. This was when I noticed the car was still there, but the guy walked right past it and just out to the road until I could no longer see him. I immediately went to the cameras to see how he got in and figure out what was going on. It only took me a minute to find the footage of him slowly and quietly getting out of the car, then going to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras back there, but those doors were never locked since the gas station was technically always open anyway. What's really odd is that there were 15 minutes between the time he went around to the back to the time he walked out onto the sales floor. Police came to help me investigate, ultimately finding the car he left to have been a stolen vehicle from months ago. They didn't know anything about the guy or his motives. Sneaking around though, he clearly had something else intended for that night, and I think I was really lucky that for one reason or another, he decided not to go through with it. This was just over 2 years ago. My name is Jake, and before this I had no camping experience whatsoever. I really wanted to get into it though, and the only way to get into it is to go out and do it. So this was my first camping trip. I chose a campground 2 hours away from my city. It was one that seemed like it wouldn't be too crowded, but also I wouldn't be completely alone, which I thought would be ideal for my first time. I drove up there and arrived at the trailhead around noon, then hiked for another few hours before getting to the campground. There were a few park-style benches and a couple ground-mounted barbecue grills around the site. A few short trails split off and went to smaller campsites, where some other people had tents set up. I went down one of these trails and put my things down, then spent the next hour getting my tent set up correctly and making sure everything was working properly. By then, a few people were in the middle area, using the grills and chatting. I'm not a super social guy, so I didn't feel comfortable inserting myself into the group. But a half hour later, a guy walked down to where I was set up and invited me to hang with them. It was a nice gesture, and he seemed cool enough, so I went with it. I followed him up and met a few of the others that were camping here. Everyone was cool, so I hung around for another hour, but after that some people split ways. I said goodnight to everyone and headed back to my tent as well. It was probably around 7, so just an hour left of sunlight, when TJ, the guy from earlier, came walking back to my tent. For reference, he was around my age, like mid to late 20s. When he came over, he asked if I'd ever been to this area before. I said no, and then he asked if I knew about the lake that was nearby. I said no again, and he immediately started telling me about this amazing hidden lake that nobody knew about and how it was a super cool spot and that he was going to head there if I wanted to tag along. Again, it seemed like a friendly gesture, and honestly, I was super intrigued. I tossed my stuff back into my tent and left everything there, then followed him. He said it was a 10-ish minute walk through the woods, so we definitely had enough time before sunset. From the campsite, we followed this really thin footpath through the trees. It wasn't a defined trail at all, but it looked like it had at least been used a few times before. 10 minutes passed though, and there was no lake in sight. TJ also got weirdly quiet. Before, he was very talkative and charismatic, and now he was suddenly giving one-word responses. He also kept looking out at the sunset, and while he could have just been trying to make sure we had time, something in me felt like he was doing the opposite. Like he was waiting for the sun to go down. After 20 minutes of walking, I started putting some distance between us. I wasn't so sure anymore about what this was, but I could feel my adrenaline kicking in, so I guess my body knew. The sun was just barely lighting up thin rows of light through the trees, and it felt like the forest was so quiet all of a sudden. When I thought I had a chance, I turned and tried to quietly run back the way we came, but he immediately noticed. He called out once in a nicer tone, as if still in character as my friend, but then he quickly turned to frustrated yelling as I could hear him sprinting behind me. There was probably an entire minute of him yelling and chasing me through the woods before I could hear his steps slowing down. Then I heard a loud metallic thump right behind me. I looked back for a split second, seeing what looked like a knife ricocheting off a tree a few feet from me. I guess it was his last-ditch effort to stop me. After that, I lost him. I got back to the others and tried to tell them what happened, and one of them called the police for me. TJ, or whoever he was, never came back. In fact, everyone said he was already at the campsite when they got there, and after a bit of looking, he didn't even have a tent anywhere. He probably targeted me though, because I was alone, and he knew I hadn't had much hiking or camping experience. Thankfully, I didn't have to find out what he had intended for that night though, because if I had, I probably wouldn't be here. I was camping in Utah for a small weekend getaway. It really was nothing special. I'd hiked up to a small lake and was only going to stay overnight. When I got there, it was more crowded than I was hoping for. I mean, there were 2 groups near the beach, so it wasn't flooding with people or anything, but it definitely wasn't quiet either. Around 5 though, both groups started packing up, and within the hour they left the area. With only an hour left of sunlight, and having the beach to myself, I quickly changed into my swimsuit and jumped into the lake. I was only in there for like 10 minutes, not too long at all, when I looked back at the campsite. The woods were calm and the sun was setting over the trees, but past the beach and a little ways into the forest, a person was watching me. They were too far for me to see much, but it was definitely a man, and they were definitely looking at me. As soon as I caught them looking, they turned their head and walked further into the trees. It was too creepy for me not to get a little shaken up. Was it just a guy from one of the groups that maybe forgot something? Or maybe a hiker that I happened to catch looking over at an awkward time? The way they were just stopped and standing there, looking directly at me, was still super unnerving. I walked back up the beach and over to my tent. I dried off and kept my head on a swivel, scanning the forest for that man. I cooked up a small meal and continued to look around for him. A whole hour passed, and there were no sightings, so I figured I was good. I stayed up fairly late, at least a couple hours after sunset, mostly looking up at the stars and resting. It sounds boring to just sit there, but it's actually really nice. After a while, I got in my tent and laid on my sleeping mattress. The hike up must have made me tired, because I fell asleep quickly. As soon as I woke up though, I felt off. I didn't know why. It was the middle of the night, and pitch black inside the tent. All I could hear were the insects chirping outside, and a calm breeze blowing against the walls of the tent. I kind of just laid there for a while, maybe like 30 seconds, as my eyes were open, but completely unable to see anything. Then my eyes started to adjust a little. I could see faint outlines of the things inside my tent, and as I moved my eyes around, they fell on the zipper. The tent flap was open, and between the opening, there was a shape. I must have stared at it for a whole 4 or 5 seconds, as my heart rate spiked, before my vision became just clear enough for me to make out a pair of eyes looking into mine. My adrenaline flooded through me, and my instincts took over. I grabbed my can of bear spray that I had laying next to me and shot it right at the opening. They yelled, and I could hear his footsteps moving away from the tent as I started tearing up and coughing. I fumbled through my backpack to get my pocket knife. Then I jumped out, fully prepared to fight for my life. But the man was gone. I didn't even know which direction he went or anything, but I didn't waste any time. I hurried to gather my things and used my handheld GPS to lead me back to the car without having to take the trail. I called police to come out and take me home because by then my eyes were burning from the bear spray. They didn't find anything, but I don't know how much they searched. Whoever that was, and what they wanted, I honestly couldn't tell you. With the image of that guy staring into my tent burned into my head, I won't be out camping again for a long time. This was a long time ago, when I was 13. It was summer. I spent pretty much all day playing on my PS3 or watching whatever was on TV. Sometimes I'd go outside or hang with some friends, but it was raining this day, so I was hunkered down inside. My dad always worked until 10, and my mom was a nurse, so her schedule was all over the place. Most of this day, I was playing on the PS3, but around 7-ish, I went to the kitchen to make food. While I was in there, a knock came at the front door. I didn't really want to answer, and as a kid, I was always nervous when someone was at the door, so I waited a minute and tried to just be quiet until they left. After they knocked several more times though, I snuck over to the door and looked out the peephole to see if maybe it was a neighbor or someone else I knew. I was really confused though, and kind of alarmed to see a police officer. He was standing on our porch, looking around and waiting for me to answer, and now I felt like I had to. I opened the door. It was still cold and rainy outside, and the officer was drenched. Being a kid, my eyes were immediately drawn toward the gun on his hip, and overall, I just felt scared, or like I was in trouble. He asked my name, then reassured me that everything was okay, and I didn't have anything to worry about. He then smiled, as if trying to keep me calm, but his teeth were noticeably rotting and yellow, which then got me to notice how overall unkempt he looked. Like, usually cops were well put together, so this was really off-putting. He definitely noticed my hesitation though, because he tried to speed up the conversation, saying he needed to search the home. I was terrified and confused, but I knew something was wrong, and that's when I noticed that there was no police car by my house. Especially with it raining, all these red flags piled up, and just as he was starting to step forward, I slammed the door and locked it. He didn't even try to say anything else. He immediately slammed something against the door, hard enough to shake the entire door and push me back a little. Thinking the door would give out, I ran to the home phone and dialed 911. I was freaking out so much, I'm surprised the operator even understood a word I said. The guy outside didn't give up the whole time though, and was even there still, banging on the door when the actual police showed up. I heard him trying to convince them he was a real cop, but obviously that didn't go well. He was taken in, and initially my parents didn't tell me much about the charges, probably for my own safety. But a few years later, they told me that during the interrogation, the man admitted to attempting to kidnap me. Had I been any more trusting, I don't know where I'd be right now.